Hello, in this video we are going to talk about different policy measures that can be applied to a perfect competitive market. Please remember that a perfect competitive market is something that satisfies very difficult conditions. In particular, we are assuming that there are infinite consumers and infinite sellers, and also that there exists perfect information about everybody's willingness to pay, which is already a very strong assumption in terms of information, but it's also a very strong assumption in terms of consumers really knowing what they're willing to pay for something. So we are really assuming there exists a demand function, right, in which consumers know how much they're willing to pay for this product. It's a downward sloping demand function, and also we have a supply function that comes from the marginal cost of producing this good, right? So if this was a perfect competitive market, of course the equilibrium would occur at the point where demand meets supply, where they both intersect. So basically we can calculate this point by saying the quantity demanded is going to be equal to the quantity supplied. With that, we will obtain the price under perfect competition. Price under perfect competition. We substitute it either in the demand function or in the supply function, and we obtain the quantity under perfect competition. Now, we say that a perfect competitive market, if it existed, is a market that maximizes welfare. All the welfare there is to take, which is the difference between willingness to pay by consumers and willingness to accept to produce by producers, is maximized. The upper part will be the consumer surplus, the lower triangle will be the producer surplus. But we are not talking about the distribution, but all welfare there is to take in this market is taken either by consumers, either by producers. Now, let's see different measures that could alter this equilibrium and actually are going to change the price and the quantity. They are going to change the results of the market. The first one would be what would happen if there exists a tax. If there exists a tax, now no longer we can say that the price the consumers pay equals the price the producers receive. When there is a tax, the price the consumers pay, that we call PD, equals the price the producers receive plus the tax. What does this mean? Well, it means that now not everything that the consumers are paying, the producers are getting it. So let's assume this is PD, and let's try to draw what would happen if there is taxes in this market. So given that the supply function is the marginal cost function, what it tells us is that in order to supply some number of units, for example this number of units, the marginal cost says the minimum price the producer should receive in order to supply that number of units. However, given that now the producers doesn't get all the price paid by the consumers, there is a part that the government gets in terms of taxes, actually now the producer would need to be paid a little bit more than before in order to supply those units. And here a little bit more than before, here a little bit more than before, for every price a little bit more than before. How much? Well, T, the difference between these two things is T. Given that the government is going to take T, the price that the producer should be receiving is the same as before, plus the T that they are not getting anymore. Notice that we are moving this supply function parallelly, so the distance between the two lines is always T. Why? Because we are assuming this is a simple tax in which you are paying T times you're paying the price plus T, always plus T, always plus T. This is not like value-added tax in which actually you will be paying a fixed percentage of the total value. So in that case, the supply function would not move parallelly, but would move like that. That would complicate the calculations, but conceptually, basically everything is the same. So when there is a tax, of course, the new point where the demand function finds the supply function with this T now is no longer the perfect competitive price, but is a higher price, where this price that we are sending here is the price the consumers pay. Where do we find the price the producers receive? Well, producers receive that price minus T. So we take this all the way down and we find the price the producers receive, PS. And how many units are sold? Well, Q when there is a tax. So we see that the effects of a tax are, first, the total quantity traded is reduced. Second, the price consumers pay increase. Third, the price producers receive decreases in total by T. And now, in terms of consumer surplus, Well, the consumer surplus now is going to be the difference between willingness to pay and price finally paid. So it's going to be consumer surplus is going to be this smaller triangle I'm highlighting here. While the producer surplus, again, will be the difference between the price they receive and the real cost of producing, not the artificial one with the T. In the cost of producing, the fact that you're paying taxes doesn't really affect the cost. So the marginal cost is still the supply function. So this triangle is the producer surplus. This triangle, what I mean is all this triangle. Okay? So what are we seeing? Well, we are seeing that there is this trapezoid of consumer surplus that is being lost, this trapezoid of producer surplus that is lost. But there is some part of that trapezoid that actually the government gets in forms of tax revenue. Why? Because for each unit sold, the government is getting T. So the area of this rectangle, right, is what we call the tax revenue. The government is getting QT units sold multiplied by T. The area of a rectangle is the base times the height. So there is some part of the welfare that consumers are losing and some part of the welfare that producers are losing that actually the government recovers in terms of tax revenue. Now, there is some part that nobody gets, which is this triangle, which is what we are going to call the efficiency loss. So, in total, the effects of a tax in a perfect competitive market are the consumer surplus is reduced, the producer surplus is reduced, some part of those reductions in surplus the government gets in forms of tax revenue, but there is some part, there is a loss of efficiency, there is a part that nobody gets, neither the government, nor consumers, nor producers. Why do we say there is an efficiency loss? Well, because it would be efficient, it would maximize welfare, it would increase the welfare, the total welfare in society, if these units were traded. Why? Because efficiency means that units end up in the hands of those who value those units most. And we are seeing that these units here, consumers are willing to pay more for them than what it costs to produce them. So it would be efficient that they would be traded, and they ended up in the hands of consumers. However, they don't because of the tax. The tax manages to reduce consumption, increases the price consumers pay, reduces the price producers receive. So if taxes are so bad, why are taxes implemented? Well, there may be two reasons. One is taxes may be applied in order to reduce consumption of something the government feels paternalistic about reducing. So for example, imagine this is tobacco. Right? With the government may manage to reduce the consumption of tobacco. Not only that, there's a second reason. The government may manage to recover, to get money that they can use, they can get money, tax revenue, that they can use actually to pay for the health costs of the people who are smoking. What is one of the problems here? That most of these taxes on consumption are implemented on goods which have very low elasticity of demand. And that means that if you increase the price by a reduction, if you decrease the quantity by an increase in the price for the consumers, but the good has a very low elasticity of demand, this is not going to have a large effect on consumption because the elasticity is low. So you are not going to change consumption so much. What you're going to do if the elasticity is low is, given that the quantity consumed is going to still be quite high, you're going to get very tax revenue. So it seems like this is good in terms of getting a lot of tax revenue, not so much in terms of recovering consumption if the elasticity of demand is low. Another caveat about the analysis we are doing here is that here we are just doing partial analysis. We are just seeing what happens to welfare in the market of this particular product. We see that consumers are worse off, producers are worse off. We are not saying anything about those who do not participate in this market. So for example, me not being a smoker, I'm happy about taxes on smoking. Why? Because it reduces how much people smoke, so there is less smoke in the air, so I don't suffer it so much. And on top of that, the government is collecting money, which hopefully they will use it for something that I appreciate, like for example, public health or public education. So this is a partial analysis of the effects of what happens in this market. This is not about whether taxes are good or bad for society, because of course, taxes will be better if this money that is collected through taxes is used at the end to do something that society values more. So partial analysis is not the same as general equilibrium analysis. See what would happen for the total society, for all the markets that exist in the economy, right? But in this particular market, they create an efficiency loss. Consumers are worse off, producers are worse off. It's true that some of the welfare that is lost is recovered by the government in terms of tax revenue, but there's still an efficiency loss. Let's see that even if a subsidy looks like a very good idea because it's going to have the complete opposite effects of a tax, still a subsidy also creates an efficiency loss. So let me erase this graph and let's analyze what happens in this exactly the same graph when we introduce a subsidy. So we have, again, we're going to have a demand function. This is Q, this is PD, this is the demand, this is going to be the supply. I'm trying to draw it exactly the same as before. This would be the perfect competitive equilibrium. So now, what's happened when there is a subsidy? Well, now again, there's going to be a discrepancy between the price consumers pay and the producers and the price the producers receive. What is this discrepancy? Well, the discrepancy is that the price the producers receive is the price the consumers pay plus the subsidy, right? S is the subsidy. So in terms of the analysis, this means that given that now the producers receive more money than what the consumers are paying, now for any quantity, the producer needs to be paid less than before in order to produce those units. So it's like we were translating the supply function downwards. And of course, if we do that, now the demand function and the new supply function, they intersect at a new point. So what we're saying is that already the quantity in perfect equilibrium with respect to the quantity under a subsidy, well, the quantity under a subsidies increase the total quantity of the products that are being sold. Now, what are the effects in terms of prices? Well, when the demand and the supply intersect, give us the price the consumers are paying, PD. Where do we find the price the producers are receiving? Well, we take that quantity all the way to the original supply function, and we find the price the producers are receiving. So with respect to perfect competition, the price under perfect competition, we see that the price consumers pay goes down, the price producers receive goes up. And everybody is also happy because consumers are buying more units and producers are also selling more units. So it seems like everybody is happier. In terms of consumer surplus, now the consumer surplus will be this larger triangle, the difference between willingness to pay and the price they are paying. So all these bigger consumer surplus. The producer surplus is also bigger because this is no longer the price the producers are receiving. They are receiving this price. So difference between price received and the original cost of producing this. The consumer surplus and the producer surplus has increased. By how much has the consumer surplus increased? I'm not calculating the consumer surplus. I'm saying that the change in the consumer surplus is this trapezoid that I'm highlighting down here, while the change in the producer surplus is this other trapezoid I'm highlighting up here. So why do I say that a subsidy also creates an efficiency loss? Well, a subsidy creates an efficiency loss because, well, of course consumers are better off and producers are better off, but the cost of the subsidy is going to be the total number of units sold, QS, multiplied by the subsidy, right? So it's going to be this whole rectangle that I'm highlighting with these points. So what we are saying is a subsidy makes everybody in the particular market better off. Those who receive these subsidies as consumers or producers, they're going to be very happy. However, the problem, because quantities increase, price paid goes down, price received goes up. But the cost of the subsidy, which is the whole rectangle, is bigger than the increase in welfare to consumers plus the increase in welfare for producers. So this is going to be the efficiency loss. Okay? So again, subsidies are great for those who participate in the market, both consumers and producers, but not so great for whoever has to pay for this. Why? Because the total cost of paying for this measure is larger than the increase in consumer surplus and producer surplus. Notice also, I could have said this when I was talking about taxes, but notice that this same analysis, we could have done it from the perspective of, instead of moving the supply function, we could have moved the demand function upwards. So basically, we could have done a graph like this, where the demand function translates upwards, right? And again, we will find this price, where this price would be, that price, we move the demand function, this is the supply function. So again, consumers will be paying this price, producers will be receiving this price, the difference will be the subsidy, this will be the quantity with the subsidy. So the effects with respect to perfect competition would be exactly the same if instead of moving the supply function downwards, what we're doing is moving the demand function upwards. The analysis would be exactly the same. Now, what is the difference between the two? Well, the effects are the same, so you can represent it geometrically, no matter with which of the two graphs. But the interpretation is different if what we are doing is actually who receives the money from the government, who receives the subsidy. In this case, it is the consumer who actually receives the subsidy. In this case, when we move the demand, this would be PS. So it's the producer who receives the money. We don't care who gets the money. The effects on the market, meaning the effects on prices and quantity sold, are the same if we analyze it this way or if we analyze it this way. And of course, here, this would be the efficiency loss. Okay? So those are the effects of a subsidy. Let me look at two other measures we are going to look at. So I'm going to delete this so we can start talking about price caps and import taxes. Okay? So with respect to price caps, what are we doing here? Again, we have a market in which we have demand and supply. This is P, that's Q. We have a demand function. We have a supply function. And now, let's assume that the government says the maximum price that can be charged for a good is some particular price, right? Well, if this is the point where without that limitation, this is the perfect competitive point, well, notice that the effects of a maximum price are going to be different if that price is above the perfect competitive one, that it's below. If it's above and it says, look, the price cannot be larger than this one, it doesn't matter, because in a perfect competitive market, it's not going to be larger, it's going to be here. So a maximum price that is above the perfect competitive price has no effect. The only one that will have some effect is a maximum price that is below the perfect competitive price. Assume this is the P max, right? The price maximum. Why? Because if this is the maximum price that can be charged, right, and it's below the perfect competitive price, of course, at that very low price, a lot of consumers will want to buy this product, all this much. However, producers at that maximum price, at most, they will produce this number of units. And actually, this is going to be the number of units sold under a maximum price. There's going to be, at that price, the market is not going to be in equilibrium. We're going to have excess demand, right? What's going to happen in terms of welfare? Well, we have to differentiate among consumers. We have to differentiate between the welfare, the consumers who actually manage to consume, receive, and the welfare of those consumers who do not manage to buy anymore. So now that this is the maximum price, this is the quantity, of course, those consumers who manage to buy, so who buy all these units, they're going to be happier. Why? Because there's going to be a larger difference between their willingness to pay and the price they end up paying. So the consumer surplus is now going to be larger than before. Okay? Now, what's going to happen to the producer surplus? The producer surplus is going to be small. Why? Because they no longer receive a perfect competitive price, they receive this smaller price. So the producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price they receive and the marginal cost of producing this thing. The producer surplus will be this much. Okay? Now, what we are seeing is that there is a part of the consumer surplus of the producer surplus that I'm highlighting with these black dots, right? That before would have been producer surplus. The producer surplus would have been all this much, right? This point should be down here, of course. So all this part of the producer surplus now is part of the consumer surplus. But also, there are two parts of efficiency loss. This first triangle is a part of the producer surplus that now producers are not getting. But also, there is a part of possible consumer surplus that these consumers would have gotten, right, that they don't get anymore. Why? Because these units are not traded. It would have been efficient to trade these units and be at this point. Why? Because consumers are willing to pay more for these units than what it costs to producers. However, with the price cap, only these units are sold, and therefore all this triangle is lost. All that triangle is efficiency loss. So overall, a price cap decreases total welfare in the market. It increases the welfare of those consumers who manage to buy. It decreases the consumer surplus of those who don't manage to buy. There is a transfer of surplus from producers to consumers, but there is also a part of the welfare that producers are not getting that now it's also lost, right? So those who manage to trade, they are better off, and they actually obtain, there's a redistributive purposes of the price cap. They get, these consumers actually get some of the welfare that before producers were getting, but still there is some part of the welfare that is lost. Think about, instead of thinking about a maximum price, you can do the same analysis. I'm not going to do it, but you could do it the same analysis for a minimum price. And for example, you could do it in the labor market, where that minimum price would be the minimum wage paid, right? First, in the labor market, realize that those who are offering a job are those who want to get, who are workers. Workers are the ones supplying labor, right? So workers are the ones who supply labor, companies are the ones who demand labor, and the price of labor is the wage. If you do the same analysis, a minimum wage says the price cannot be below this one. So do the analogies. If the price cannot be below some price, that would mean, at the end I'm doing the graph, so this is wage, this is labor, this is the demand of labor, which is what companies are asking for, this is the supply of labor, right? So a minimum wage would be a wage that instead of being the one that we would obtain under competition, would be a minimum wage would be up here. And of course, at that very high price, or higher price than competition, workers would like to supply all these much, however, companies would only hire these people. So this would be labor under a minimum wage. The wage will be higher, wage minimum will be higher than the perfect competition, but of course that is going to create the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is going to be smaller, so companies who are the ones who are consuming labor, they're going to be worse off. Those workers that get a job, so the producers of labor, who are the workers, they're going to have a higher producer surplus, but there's going to be a part of welfare that is lost, which match, this match. So what we are saying is that a minimum wage in the market of labor is going to decrease employment, less people will be paid, it's going to raise the minimum wage pay. Companies are going to be worse off because they are hiring less workers and they are paying higher wages. Workers, those workers who manage to get a job, they're going to be better off because they're being paid more, right? So they take some part of the previous consumer surplus, but there is some part that is lost. So one of the arguments here, this graph could be used to say, why do trade unions actually defend the fact that there are minimum wages? Well, mainly because they don't care about these people being laid off. Unions, they are worker unions, they represent workers, so all they want to have is those who manage to get a job, they want them to be happy, and they are going to be happier because they get a maximum wage. They don't care so much about all these people who don't get a job with respect to the perfect competitive case because they don't represent them. So trade unions do not need necessarily to care about the level of employment, they just care about the level of wages of those who they are representing. Of course, this is a simplified version of the discussion about policy, of why what are the effects of minimum wages. But, under the assumptions where we really have a supply function like this, a demand function like this, etc., these are the effects of a minimum wage in a perfect competitive market. What I'm saying is that if all we care about is efficiency, this all we care is about efficiency, there is an efficiency loss in this market. Out of the total welfare, there is something that is lost. We are not talking about the redistribution. It's true that if we care about redistribution, perhaps we are happy about the workers getting the higher wages. Perhaps actually we want workers to get a minimum wage that is sufficient enough for subsistence level, because that may be good for the economy, it may be good for society, it may be good because we actually care about redistribution. But now we are introducing other considerations apart from the fact of what happens in a very stabilized, perfect competitive market and what happens in terms of efficiency. The discussion of efficiency is that at least because some people are being laid off, right, there is a total loss of efficiency. Now, let me discuss with these very simple graphs the final thing I want to describe, which is protectionist policies. Protectionist policies in terms of international trade, that what they do is they put a tax on imports. The rationale to put a tax on imports is actually to try to protect national producers, right? By making imports more expensive, of course, consumers will not think so much about buying from abroad and they will buy national. So if we are going to talk about imports and taxes on imports, it is important that we distinguish between the national production and the production done by international companies. So let's have a demand, right? A demand, let's call it national demand. So this is the demand of internal consumers. We are a government of the nationals. We don't care about who buys these products from abroad. We are doing the analysis in the national market. So it's the demand of people in national. And let's have a supply function of national companies. So we just care about those companies that are national. And now let's assume that it is possible to buy this product also in the international market. That doesn't mean we're going to care about the international production. For us, from the perspective of this market, the international market is just going to be a price. It's going to be the price at which things are sold in this international market, which we are going to assume that it's a price that it's below international price, P international, that it's below the perfect competitive price. Right? So this is the analysis. So if there are no taxes, well, what is the total production that is going to be traded in this market? Well, consumers will buy from whoever sells it cheaper. So the very first consumers, well, this is the international price. This is the minimum price national producers would need to be paid in order to produce. So the very first units, they're going to be bought from national producers. But from this point onwards, the price that national producers can offer is above the international price. So from here onwards, consumers will buy the international at the international price. So what does it mean? It means that the point where demand intersects with the total supply, which is the national supply plus international price, is this point. This is going to be the total quantity. Now, out of the total quantity, how much are consumers, national consumers, going to buy from national companies? Well, the first part, this would be Q bought from national companies. And what would be the difference between the total quantity and the quantities bought from national companies? Well, what we call imports. This is what they will buy from other companies. So in terms of the consumer surplus, what is the consumer surplus going to be? If there were no imports, the consumer surplus, this would be the price and the quantity, so the consumer surplus would be this upper triangle. Now that there are imports and they can buy cheaper, in total, there's only going to be one price, so national consumers are going to sell at the same price as the international price. So the price is going to be this for everybody, so this is going to be the total quantity. So consumers are going to get a much higher consumer surplus because we are open to an international market that forces competition prices to be lower for everybody. So consumers are going to be happier in all these months because they're getting higher consumer surplus. And the producer surplus of national companies, which are the only ones we care about, is going to be this lower triangle, right? This is the producer surplus, all this triangle is the consumer surplus. Now, let's see to this what happens to this market if actually there is an import tax. So the government says, you know what, we want to increase the producer surplus of national companies. We want companies from our country to actually sell more and people not to import so much. So what does an import tax reflect on? Well, an import tax increases the price, the international price. So for example, it may increase it, let's assume that it's still below the perfect competitive price, but it decreases by that, it increases the price by that. This is the international price plus the tax. For every unit that is imported, consumers now have to pay the tax. So what happens now? Well, it happens that, of course, now that the total international price is higher because consumers would have to pay the tax if they imported, they wouldn't have to pay the tax if they buy national. Well, that's artificially making national companies more competitive. And now the point where national production is still competitive with respect to international production is no longer here, it's up here. All these things are traded could be traded at a lower price than the international price. So basically what I'm saying is that now the national quantity with the tax is going to increase in all this match, right? So now we are going to sell, and national companies are going to sell more. In total, what's going to happen? Well, the demand is going to meet the new supply function, which is the national production plus the new total import tax with international price with the tax. Now they intersect at this point. So in total, sales are going to be reduced. So if total sales are less, but national production is high, what means is that imports are reduced with the tax. Imports with the tax, right? So we are going to be at this point. What's going to happen to consumers? Well, consumers are going to be worse off. Why? Because of two reasons. First, in total, they're going to be buying less units. And also, in total, all the units are going to be traded at the new international price with the tax. So in total, the consumer surplus is no longer going to be this big triangle, but it's going to be this smaller triangle. So the consumer surplus is going to be reduced in this trapezoid that I'm highlighting with black dots. That's the reduction in consumer surplus. But there are some positive things going on here. The first one is national producers are going to be happier because of two reasons. First, they sell more, and also they receive a higher price. So the producer surplus now with the tax is going to be this bigger triangle that I'm highlighting here. National producers are going to be better off because they sell more and they receive a higher price. So import taxes actually decreases the consumer surplus, but it increases the producer surplus. We are transferring some welfare from consumers to producers. The decrease in consumer surplus is all this trapezoid, the increase in producer surplus is this much. Now, is this the only effect of the import tax? No. Apart from increasing the producer surplus in this area, also the government is getting revenue. What revenue? Revenue for tax imports. So how much revenue the government is getting? They're getting T for all the units that are imported. Which are the units that are imported now with the tax? Only this many. So this is tax revenue. This rectangle is the tax revenue. So in total, what are we seeing? Well, out of the whole loss in terms of consumer surplus, consumers are worse because the government is making importing more expensive, right? Out of the whole loss in consumer surplus, there is a part that national producers get, and there is a part that the government gets in terms of tax revenue. What are the only parts that nobody gets? Well, this loss of consumer surplus, nobody recovers, right? So this triangle is part of the loss in consumer surplus and nobody recovers. Plus this triangle, nobody recovers. So those two black triangles are going to be what we call the efficiency loss of an import tax. An import tax manages to stimulate the national production. We produce more from here to here, right? But it does it at a total cost that is negative. In terms of total welfare, it's decreased because consumers lose a lot of welfare. Some of that welfare is recovered by producers, by national producers, some of that welfare is recovered in terms of tax revenue, but there are these two little triangles that nobody gets. Okay? So finally, to try to understand all these things, one thing that would be very useful is if you start thinking about what are the effects also in terms of efficiency loss, but also in consumer surplus and producer surplus, if you start considering what would happen depending on whether the demands and the supplies that I've been analyzing, they are vertical, they are horizontal, they are more elastic, less elastic. Is the efficiency loss going to be larger? Is going to be smaller? Why don't you also try to give numbers to what is the tax that you are including, what is the demand function, what is the supply function, and you play around with the calculations. Once you have understood the graphs, looking at what are the intersection points and calculating the areas of a triangle, of trapezoids or rectangles should be very easy. So with numbers, you can do all the calculations, okay? Remember that this is partial analysis of policies, so we are just looking at the effects of all these 4 policies we have considered: taxes, subsidies, price caps, minimum or maximum, and import taxes in the particular market in which they are applied, right? And we have seen that what are the effects in terms of the quantity, what are the effects in terms of the prices paid, which may be different, the price received and the price paid, right? And finally, what are the effects in terms of welfare, consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, and when we have a national and international market, we do care, because we are the national government, we do care about the producer surplus only in terms of the producer surplus. We don't care about the surplus of other international countries and other international producers. Okay? So I hope this clarifies the whole thing. There's a lot of content in this video to digest, so take it easy. And if you have any questions, please email me at pedro.rey@esade.edu. Okay? Thank you very much.